There were 3 dry ways around the puddle, and I refused all of them. My ex said a real gentleman would become the bridge if he would not sacrifice his coat. Daniel told him no. He told me that if I let Ryan touch him, we would leave separately. I laughed and said my husband would do nothing. Ryan shoved Daniel face down into the muddy water, planted a shoe between his shoulders, and held out his hand to me. Daniel told me not to step on him. I did. I used my husband's back to keep my suede heels dry, then watched Ryan follow me across. When Daniel rolled and sent Ryan into the same mud, I expected our friends to condemn him. Instead, they stood between us and Daniel. By midnight, every person I had invited had left the courtyard with the quiet man I had treated like a path beneath my feet. My name is Natalie Mercer. I was 35, and I sold corporate events for a waterfront hotel outside Baltimore. I knew how to place strangers at tables, so they believed they had always belonged together. I could turn a delayed dinner into anticipation, a leaking tent into atmosphere, and an insult from a drunk client into a story everyone repeated with a smile. My job depended on protecting the mood. If one person became uncomfortable, I did not stop the room. I persuaded that person to become easier. Daniel had been my husband for 9 years. He was 38 and worked as a commercial electrician. During storms, he volunteered with a county response crew that checked shelters, generators, and damaged buildings before families were allowed back inside. He carried spare fuses in his truck, remembered which neighbor needed oxygen at night, and could tell from the sound of a refrigerator whether the motor was failing. People called him when something had to work by morning. That was also the problem I had learned to name whenever I wanted permission to resent him. Daniel could repair a room more easily than he could live inside its emotions. If I told him I felt lonely, he asked whether I wanted the weekend free. If I said we never did anything spontaneous, he opened his calendar. If an argument grew sharp, he flattened his right hand against the nearest surface and waited until his breathing slowed before answering. He called that discipline. I experienced it as being left alone with every feeling until he considered the room safe enough to return. I had not always despised that restraint. 3 weeks after we began dating, my apartment building lost power during a February freeze. Daniel arrived with 2 lanterns, a sleeping bag, and enough food for the elderly woman across the hall. He spent 6 hours helping the maintenance crew thaw a pipe and then slept sitting upright beside me because the floor was wet. I told my mother I had met the first man who made disaster feel ordinary. Years later, ordinary was the word that hurt him. My mother had spent 27 years beside a man who rarely shouted, rarely touched her, and never asked why she stopped singing in the kitchen. When I was 16, she told me that peace and happiness could occupy the same house without ever meeting. I decided I would never disappear inside a sensible marriage. Daniel knew that. He also knew that I needed visible affection sometimes, not another full tank of gas or repaired cabinet hinge. He promised to try. I promised to notice the ways he already did. We both kept our promises until keeping them became inconvenient. The navy jacket first appeared at our courthouse wedding. Daniel's father, Frank, had bought it for him after saving cash in an envelope for almost a year. Frank had been a hard man when Daniel was young. He punched walls, broke chairs, and once frightened Daniel's mother badly enough that she slept at her sister's house for a week. By the time I met him, diabetes had weakened his legs and regret had softened his voice. He never found a graceful way to apologize. The jacket was the closest he came. Frank died 18 months after our wedding. Daniel had the sleeves altered twice because he refused to replace it. He wore it to funerals, graduations, anniversary dinners, and every occasion he believed deserved the best thing his father had managed to give him. The lining was worn near the inside pocket. One button was a shade darker than the others. It was not expensive enough to impress anyone who did not know the story. I knew the story. Ryan Cole knew it because I told him. Ryan had been my boyfriend during my last 2 years of college. He was loud, athletic, and talented at making attention feel like a prize. He once climbed onto the hood of his car outside my dorm and shouted my name until 3 floors of students leaned from their windows. At 21, I thought embarrassment was proof that a man had forgotten the rest of the world for me. He also forgot rent, promises, and any woman who was not standing in front of him. We ended badly. He called me demanding. I called him unreliable. For 14 years, he existed mostly as a bright comparison I used when Daniel's steadiness felt dull. Our old friend Lena found Ryan while planning a 15-year reunion for the 6 people who had survived the same college apartment complex. Lena and her husband, Marcus, rented a small lakeside inn for an autumn weekend. Paige and Owen Brooks were coming from Pennsylvania. Ryan had recently moved back after a divorce and accepted the invitation before anyone asked whether his presence might complicate mine. Daniel did not forbid me to go. That detail mattered later because I used it as evidence of his weakness. He only asked why Ryan needed to stay at the same inn when the nearest town had 2 hotels. I said we were adults and that making special arrangements would tell everyone our marriage could not handle an old boyfriend. Daniel said our marriage could handle Ryan, but he was not sure it could handle the version of myself I became around people whose approval I wanted. I accused him of preparing to blame me for a weekend that had not happened. He placed his right hand flat on the kitchen island. A pale scar crossed his palm from an electrical accident before we met. He flexed the fingers once, then said he would come because these were his friends too. He asked me not to discuss private parts of our marriage with Ryan. I agreed while my phone already held 3 days of messages proving I had not kept that boundary. Ryan had begun by asking whether Daniel was still as calm as he remembered. I answered that calm was a generous word for a man who treated every argument like a hazardous panel. Ryan wanted to know whether Daniel had ever actually fought for anything. I told him Daniel had wrestled in school but refused to fight as an adult because he feared becoming his father. I even described the hand ritual Daniel used when he was angry. I said that if Ryan saw Daniel flatten his palm, it meant he had reached the limit of what he could say. Ryan replied that limits were only interesting when someone crossed them. I sent a laughing face. The reunion planning chat included Lena and Paige, but Ryan and I had a separate thread. 2 weeks before the trip, I returned to the group chat and proposed a few harmless tests to see whether marriage had made any of us predictable. I suggested that Ryan take my chair, steal the first dance, or ask Daniel to perform some old-fashioned gesture. I wrote that Daniel spent his life solving practical problems and could survive one evening in which practicality did not make him the hero. Paige asked what kind of gesture I meant. I answered that we would know it when we saw it. Lena sent a warning that the weekend was a reunion, not a reality show. I told her she worried too much. When nobody responded, I assumed they had accepted my judgment. That was how I handled silence. I filled it with consent. On the Friday of the reunion, rain followed us for most of the drive. Daniel wore the navy jacket because Lena had planned a formal dinner in the inn's old dining room. He had a garment bag in the back seat but decided the jacket would wrinkle less on him. I watched him check the weather and place waterproof boots beside my suitcase. I had chosen thin suede heels. Daniel suggested I pack different shoes. I said the point of a beautiful place was to look beautiful inside it. He put a pair of rubber-soled flats in the side pocket of my suitcase without arguing. I noticed and left them there. The inn sat beyond a line of yellow maples, with a stone courtyard between the main house and a glass pavilion near the lake. Rainwater ran from the hill and collected along the gravel path. Marcus was directing cars beneath the covered entrance when we arrived. Daniel left our bags under the awning and went back into the rain to help him move a portable heater. Ryan arrived 10 minutes later in a black convertible he had no reason to drive in October. He stepped beneath the awning, shook rain from his hair, and hugged me long enough for Lena to look at Daniel. Daniel was carrying the heater with Marcus. His face did not change. Ryan opened his trunk and pointed toward 2 leather cases. He told Daniel they were fragile and should go upstairs rather than remain near the wet floor. He did not ask. He pointed. Daniel set down the heater and said Ryan could find the staircase through the lobby. Ryan looked at me as if Daniel had failed a simple test. I laughed and said Daniel was usually the only competent man in any building, but apparently competence had business hours. Marcus lifted one of Ryan's cases before the silence settled. Daniel took it from him, not from Ryan, and carried it inside. I told myself he had decided to be helpful. I did not admit that Marcus had protected the mood for me. The first photograph happened before dinner. Lena gathered us beneath the staircase because the carved railing made the inn look older and more expensive than it was. Daniel stood beside me. Ryan came down late, placed one hand on my shoulder, and said college photographs required the original arrangement. He slid between us. Daniel asked him to stand on the other side. Ryan grinned at the camera. I told Daniel not to turn a photograph into a territorial dispute. Then I leaned toward Ryan so nobody could accuse me of looking uncomfortable. In the finished picture, Daniel stood half a step away from the group. His right hand was open against his thigh. I saw the gesture and chose to look at the camera. At dinner, the table was crowded with old stories. Ryan described the night he climbed onto his car for me. Paige remembered campus security threatening to tow it while he continued shouting. Everyone laughed. Daniel smiled once and asked whether the car had ever started again after that winter. Ryan said men who took risks occasionally broke things. Daniel answered that men who broke things usually depended on someone else to repair them. The table went quiet for half a breath. I could have let Daniel keep that small victory. Instead, I told everyone that this was the difference between the two men. Ryan created memories. Daniel kept the lights on so other people could have them. Lena said keeping the lights on sounded useful. I answered that useful was not the same as alive. Daniel looked at me rather than Ryan. He did not defend himself. That made me go further because I had learnt to interpret his refusal to perform as permission to write his part. I raised my glass and said Ryan had once made me feel chosen in front of a whole building. Daniel was the man people chose after the excitement ended and the bills arrived. I intended it as a complicated compliment. Ryan lifted his drink to accept the half that belonged to him. Nobody joined the toast. Daniel folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. He asked me to walk into the hall with him. I wanted to refuse, but that would have made the tension visible. We stopped near a cabinet filled with old china where the dining room door remained partly open. Daniel said I was using him as the price of Ryan's attention. I told him I had praised his reliability. He said I had described our marriage as the place where excitement came to die. I answered that if the description embarrassed him, perhaps he should ask why it felt true. His hand flattened against the china cabinet. He looked through the open door at the people pretending not to listen. Then he said we could leave together before the fire pit gathering. We could drive home, talk the next day, and spare both of us whatever Ryan believed he had been invited to prove. I heard an ultimatum. I told him leaving would reward his jealousy and punish everyone who had travelled to see us. Daniel reminded me that I had been the one talking about him all evening. He asked once, very clearly, whether I was choosing to stay because I wanted our friends or because I wanted Ryan to keep going. I said I would not let him control the mood. He nodded. It was not surrender, but I was still committed to reading it that way. When we returned, Ryan had moved Daniel's chair several inches from mine. Nobody admitted doing it. Daniel sat without correcting the distance. Dessert arrived with a bottle of bourbon Marcus had saved since his wedding. Ryan poured too much into his glass. While reaching across Daniel, he knocked the drink onto the floor beside the navy jacket. Bourbon splashed Daniel's trouser cuff and darkened the rug. Ryan pointed toward a sideboard and told Daniel towels were stored beneath it. Daniel stayed seated. Ryan repeated himself with the patient tone adults use for stubborn children. Daniel said Ryan had spilled it and could clean it. I heard the challenge in the room before Ryan answered. I stood, collected the towels myself, and told Daniel that refusing a simple task did not make him strong. Daniel said neither did ordering another man to clean a mess. Ryan laughed and called him sensitive. Owen told Ryan to clean the floor. Ryan did, but he made a performance of kneeling and asked whether everyone felt safer now that Daniel had defended the dignity of a towel. No one laughed. That should have ended the evening. Instead, I became angry at the room for changing without my permission. The rain had stopped by 9. Lena suggested cancelling the fire pit because the courtyard was soaked. Ryan looked through the glass doors and said a little mud had never ruined a good night. He was speaking to me. I said I had not brought outdoor shoes. Daniel reminded me about the flats in my suitcase. Ryan shook his head and said a woman should not have to change her shoes when 6 supposed gentlemen were present. Marcus told him the dry route followed the covered veranda and added less than a minute. Ryan called that an electrician's solution. I looked at Daniel and said the safe route was the story of our marriage. There was always a practical way around the thing I actually wanted. Daniel asked what I wanted. I should have said that I wanted him to take my hand and walk beside me. That answer would have been honest enough to save us. Instead, I said I wanted one gesture that did not arrive with instructions. Ryan stepped between us and examined the puddle spreading across the shortest path to the pavilion. It was not deep, perhaps 2 inches of brown water over loose gravel, but it was almost 4 feet wide. My heels would sink if I tried to jump it. Ryan said men once laid their coats across puddles for women. Marcus told him men once died from infected cuts too, and neither tradition required reenactment. Ryan ignored him and asked Daniel for the navy jacket. Daniel said no. The word was quiet and immediate. There was no delay, no hand on a surface, no uncertainty for me to misread. Ryan looked at me. I told Daniel it was only a jacket and that dry cleaning existed. Daniel said Ryan had his own coat upstairs. Ryan answered that using his own would defeat the test. Lena told me to put on the flats. Paige said we could all use the veranda. The room had given me 2 exits, and Daniel had given me a third. I rejected all of them because each one allowed Ryan's idea to end without proving who controlled the scene. Ryan looked from the jacket to Daniel and said there was an older version of the tradition. If the gentleman valued his coat too much, he could become the bridge himself. Marcus told him that was enough. Owen stepped away from the pavilion door. Daniel did not laugh. Ryan ordered him to lie across the puddle. Daniel said no again. Then he turned to me and said we were leaving. He told me to collect my bag. I asked why he had to ruin every playful moment by turning it into an order. Daniel said nothing about the scene was playful now. He offered me his hand and pointed toward the veranda. Ryan asked whether the county's famous storm responder was afraid of getting his knees wet. I said Daniel was not afraid. I said he simply could not do anything unless it came with a safety checklist. Daniel lowered his hand. He told me that if I let Ryan put his hands on him, we would leave the inn separately. That warning made the choice completely clear. I could no longer call the next moment a misunderstanding. I looked at Ryan and said Daniel would do nothing. I reminded him that my husband had spent his whole life proving he was not his father. Ryan moved behind Daniel before Marcus could reach us. He drove both hands between Daniel's shoulder blades. Daniel's shoes slid on the wet gravel. He went forward hard, catching himself on his palms before his face struck the water. His knees landed on stone. The navy jacket spread across his back as his chest came down into the shallow puddle. Brown water splashed over the collar and one cheek. Marcus swore and started toward him. Ryan planted one shoe between Daniel's shoulders and pressed him flat. Daniel turned his face to the side so his mouth stayed clear of the water. He told Ryan to remove the foot. Ryan called him the most useful thing in the courtyard. He held one hand out to me and said my bridge was ready. Lena said my name sharply. Paige told me not to move. Owen was already circling the puddle toward Ryan. I raised one hand and told them Daniel was fine. I said Ryan was giving him the chance to do one romantic thing without measuring it first. Daniel looked at me from the water. Mud ran from his hair across his temple. He told me not to step on him. Ryan shifted his shoe lower on Daniel's back, keeping him down, and reached farther for me. I took Ryan's hand. My left heel landed between Daniel's shoulder blades. I felt his body tighten beneath my shoe. The narrow heel pressed through the wet jacket until it found the muscle beside his spine. Daniel said my name once. I could have stepped backward. I remember that more clearly than the laughter. Daniel gave me space to make the first touch a mistake. I smiled because 6 friends were watching and shame felt more dangerous than cruelty. I moved my weight forward, placed my other foot on the dry stone beyond him, and used my husband's back to cross the puddle without wetting my shoes. Ryan laughed. I laughed with him. I said Daniel had finally made himself useful in a romantic way. Nobody else made a sound. On the far side, I turned and kept hold of Ryan's hand. He removed the shoe, pinning Daniel down, and stepped onto the middle of Daniel's back. Unlike me, he put the full sole of a heavy dress shoe across the jacket. Daniel told him to step off. Ryan transferred his weight forward and lifted his second foot from the gravel. He called Daniel a frightened son, pretending to be a better man than his father. The words came from me. I had given Ryan that history because I wanted him to understand Daniel. He had saved it for the moment it could cut deepest. Daniel's right hand opened against the gravel. Ryan saw it and smiled because I had also explained the gesture. Daniel warned him a second time. Ryan bent his knee and pressed down as though Daniel were a board he needed to test. Daniel moved once. He rolled toward the open side of the puddle, caught Ryan's ankle against his chest, and drove upward from one knee. Ryan's other foot had no ground beneath it. He turned sideways and hit the muddy water with his hip and shoulder. Daniel released the ankle immediately. He stood, water streaming from his jacket and trousers, and stepped onto the stone with both hands open. Ryan rolled onto one elbow, coughing and swearing. His white shirt was brown from shoulder to hip. He tried to stand and charge Daniel again. Owen reached him first. He planted himself between the 2 men and pushed Ryan back with one forearm. Marcus came from the other side and told Ryan he would not touch Daniel again. I ran to Ryan. I asked whether he had hit his head. Then I turned on Daniel and accused him of attacking a guest because he could not tolerate one joke. That was the moment I expected our friends to return to their familiar roles. Lena would protect the weekend. Marcus would calm the men. Paige would say everyone had been drinking. Owen would tell Daniel that walking away made him the bigger person. I expected the room to make my version easier because that was what rooms had always done for me. Lena walked past Ryan and helped Daniel pull off the navy jacket. Mud streamed from the sleeves. A narrow heel cut marked the cloth between the shoulders. Ryan's broad tread had left a darker scrape below it. Lena held the jacket away from her dress and asked whether I remembered Daniel telling me not to step on him. I told her Ryan had pushed him and turned the moment into something ugly. She said Ryan was not the only person who had used Daniel's body as a bridge. Marcus removed his own dry coat and placed it around Daniel. Daniel's muddy hand left a print near the lapel. Marcus did not flinch. He asked whether Daniel could breathe without pain. Daniel drew one careful breath, then rotated the wrist that had struck the gravel. Ryan shouted that Daniel had assaulted him. Owen answered that every person there had watched Ryan shove Daniel face down, hold him under a shoe, and step on his back after I crossed first. Paige said she would provide that account to anyone who asked. I told Paige she had been laughing earlier. She said she had laughed at the luggage joke because she thought the cruelty would end when Daniel stopped smiling. Then she took out her phone. The reunion planning chat appeared on the screen. My messages were visible. I had written that Daniel needed to perform like a gentleman for once. I had told Ryan to keep pushing until Daniel gave us a reaction. I had added that my husband would never swing because he was too afraid of his own blood. I asked why Paige had saved screenshots of a joke. She said she started saving them when I deleted one about using Daniel's father against him. I had forgotten deleting it. She had not. Ryan stopped accusing Daniel long enough to look at me. The expression was not loyalty or concern. It was calculation. He said I had designed the tests and had promised Daniel would understand. I reminded him that using Daniel as a bridge had been his idea. He said I was the first person who chose to step. Without the others laughing, Ryan and I started blaming each other almost immediately. Daniel listened while we divided responsibility into smaller pieces. He did not defend himself because nobody was asking him to. Lena told me to collect my things and leave the inn. I said she could not throw me out of a reunion I had helped plan. Marcus said the rental agreement was in his name and the decision was no longer social. I asked whether Ryan was also being removed. Marcus said Ryan was leaving first. Owen walked him toward the covered entrance while Ryan complained about his back and threatened to call the police. Paige repeated that she had screenshots and 6 witnesses. Ryan's threat became quieter with every step. I turned to Daniel and said we should go home. I used we because marriage had always returned him to the position beside me. Daniel looked at the shoe marks across the jacket in Lena's hands, then at the coat Marcus had placed around his shoulders. He said I had not wanted a romantic husband. I had wanted another man to turn my husband into something I could walk on and call romance. I told him he was making 1 terrible minute more important than 9 years. Daniel answered that the minute mattered because it contained 9 years of choices in a form our friends could finally see. He asked Paige to send the screenshots to him. He asked Owen to photograph the marks across his back and the jacket before the mud shifted. Then he asked Lena whether she had a plastic bag for it. He did not ask me for an apology. That frightened me more than anger would have. Lena and Marcus placed my suitcase beneath the entrance awning. Ryan stood near his convertible, soaked and furious. But he had been drinking, and Marcus would not give him the keys he had surrendered at dinner. A rideshare was 40 minutes away. Ryan blamed me for the wait. I blamed Daniel for making the weekend impossible. Nobody responded in the group chat because Paige had removed both Ryan and me. Through the lobby windows, I watched the others gather around Daniel. Lena brought ice for his wrist and ribs. Owen found pain medicine. Marcus made tea. Paige held the plastic bag while Daniel folded the ruined jacket as carefully as the wet fabric allowed. These were small, practical acts, the kind Daniel had performed for all of us for years. I had called them ordinary when he did them. From outside the glass, they looked like allegiance. The rideshare stopped at the far side of the courtyard because the driver would not cross the flooded gravel. There was a dry route along the veranda. Ryan refused to take it because it meant passing the lobby windows. He walked straight through the puddle instead. His shoes disappeared in the brown water. I stood at the edge in my stained suede heels. No one opened the door. No man removed a coat. The navy jacket was inside with Daniel. I followed Ryan through the mud. At the hotel in town, he took the bed and gave me the chair beside the window. By morning, he had rewritten the night so completely that even I could hear the resemblance to my own excuses. He said Daniel had baited him. He said the human bridge joke meant nothing until I chose to step. He said our friends had always preferred Daniel and had been waiting for a reason to turn on us. When I asked what us meant, Ryan told me not to make the situation emotional. His ex-wife arrived at noon to collect him because the convertible remained at the inn. He left without asking how I would get home. Daniel did not answer my calls. Marcus drove him back in our car and stayed while Daniel packed. By the time I reached the house, 2 suitcases were gone, along with his tools, his storm response bag, and the old wooden box that held Frank's papers. The bathroom cabinet looked half empty. His work boots were missing from the mat. The practical parts of separation began immediately. Daniel froze no money and made no threats. He transferred his portion of the household expenses, listed the automatic payments, and sent me the name of the mediator he had contacted. His efficiency offended me. I said he was using preparation to avoid grief. He answered that he had been grieving in rooms where I kept telling him not to ruin the mood. Ryan filed no complaint. Owen later told me that Marcus returned his keys only after Ryan signed a brief statement acknowledging that he had pushed Daniel down and stepped on him. Paige sent the screenshots to Daniel and to the other friends. Lena wrote one message to me. She said she used to believe my jokes landed harder than I intended. After watching me place my heel between Daniel's shoulders, she no longer believed that. I lost the friend group in pieces. Paige blocked me first. Owen declined a holiday invitation. Marcus returned a wedding gift I had stored in his garage. Lena kept one channel open only because the inn charged us for cleaning and damage. Every person who had once accepted my explanations now compared them with what they had seen. I tried to tell my mother that Daniel had become violent. She asked who put the other man in the puddle first. I said Ryan had pushed Daniel down, but Daniel could have stayed calm. She asked whether I had stayed on the stone when my husband told me not to step on him. I accused her of taking his side without being there. She said that was the advantage of a clear fact. It did not need her in the courtyard. Daniel had bruised ribs, a sprained wrist, and a cut along his cheek from the gravel. He missed 3 days of fieldwork but continued coordinating calls from Marcus's guest room. The detail reached me through a mutual friend. I wanted to point out that the injuries were minor. Then I remembered telling everyone he was fine while Ryan's shoe was still pressing between his shoulders. Our mediator used neutral words: property, accounts, temporary residence, communication boundaries. Nothing in the room sounded like the courtyard. Daniel remained calm. He did not mention Ryan unless the mediator asked. When I said the reunion had exposed problems both of us created, Daniel agreed. For one hopeful second, I thought agreement meant a path back. Then he said his silence had hurt me and that he should have confronted our distance earlier. He said none of that explained my decision to put my heel on his back after he told me not to. Understanding my grievance did not require him to share responsibility for what I did with it. That distinction left me with nowhere to place half the blame. I asked whether one defensive movement had made him feel powerful. He touched the wrist that had healed and said rolling Ryan into the water was the least important choice he made that night. The important choice was believing the weight of my heel after he had spent years explaining away my words. The divorce became final 7 months later. There was no courtroom speech, no ruined career, and no hidden fortune waiting to prove I had underestimated him. Daniel remained an electrician. I remained in event sales. Ryan moved to another dealership 2 counties away. We all went back to work, which meant I could not blame the divorce on one wild night forever. At the final property exchange, Daniel came to the house with Marcus. I had sent the navy jacket to a specialist cleaner because returning it seemed like proof that I understood. The cleaner removed most of the mud and reinforced the lining. A wide brown shadow remained across the back. Ryan's tread had scraped the lower cloth, and one narrow crescent cut remained where my heel had driven gravel through the fabric between Daniel's shoulders. I carried the garment bag into the hall and told Daniel I had done everything possible to repair it. He opened the zipper and touched the damaged cloth with his left hand. His right wrist had healed, though he still rotated it carefully. He did not thank me. He did not accuse me. He lifted the jacket from the bag and folded it over his arm. I asked why he wanted to keep something that would always remind him of the worst night of our marriage. Daniel said the jacket belonged to his father before it ever became evidence of me. My cruelty did not get to decide which memories he was allowed to keep. Marcus carried the last box to the truck. Daniel followed him. The navy jacket rested across the same arm that had carried groceries, luggage, tool cases, my mother's hospital bag, and every quiet burden I had stopped counting because he never asked the room to watch. Near the door, the garment bag slipped open. I saw the dark tread and the narrow cut again. The cleaner had removed the mud, but my heel had gone through the cloth between his shoulders.